In 2017, a Brazilian cosmetics company founded in a São Paulo garage generated 5 billion Brazilian reais in a single year. This was a multinational corporation with decades of global history, nor was it backed by Silicon Valley billionaires. It was a family from São Paulo's North Zone who had transformed hand-packaged soaps into one of Brazil's most explosive business phenomena. In just 5 years, the company had grown by over 1,000%. From every corner of the country, in WhatsApp groups, evangelical churches, and beauty salons in the outskirts, the name Hinode was pronounced with the same devotion one might speak of a promise of salvation. But behind the packed stadium events, the smiling faces on posters, and the chain messages promising financial freedom, there was a mechanism already showing its first cracks. When the structure began to yield, the collapse was as swift as its spectacular rise. This is the story of how Hinode was born from a humble dream, conquered all of Brazil with the promise of quick wealth, and then entered one of the most dramatic declines ever seen in the national direct sales market. But what if the very promise of salvation that propelled its meteoric rise was also the seed of its dramatic downfall? It all began long before the stadiums and the billions. In 1983, Adelaide Rodrigues, a seamstress from northern São Paulo, needed to supplement her family's income. With quiet determination and no glamour, she began reselling cosmetics door to door. In less than 2 years, her sales earnings surpassed the salary of her husband, Francisco, a metalworker. Her success was so undeniable that Francisco quit his job to help her. Soon after, the couple's eldest son, Sandro, also joined the business. In 1988, the family took the decisive step. They founded their own company in their home garage, with products packaged by hand, modest in appearance but brimming with ambition. The brand name was chosen after a curious conversation. Adelaide asked a Japanese friend how to say rising sun in his language. The answer was Hinode. The name sounded different, exotic, luminous, everything the Rodrigues family wanted to project to the world, a new dawn. For years, the company grew organically and discreetly. In 1999, they moved their factory to Alphaville, São Paulo. In 2003, the Hinode brand was officially launched, and in 2008, Sandro Rodrigues, who had taken over as company president in 1995, made the decision that would change everything, to transition to a multi-level marketing model. The transition was far from glorious. In the first month under the new system, revenue plummeted by 90%. The company, which had generated about 700 Brazilian reais monthly in its best days before the change, saw its money simply evaporate. There followed 4 years of pure survival. Sandro and his family poured their own resources into keeping the company alive. It was the desert that precedes the miracle, or at least, that's how the story would later be told. In 2012, the gears finally clicked into place. Hinode adjusted its direct sales model and launched a franchise system to serve its resellers. The timing was perfect. Brazil was experiencing a growing economic crisis, with high unemployment and a working class hungry for alternative income. Hinode offered exactly what Brazil needed to hear. You can be your own boss, work on your own time, and build wealth with effort and dedication. The narrative was powerful, emotional, and irresistible. In 2012, the company had 35,000 registered consultants. 4 years later, in 2016, that number had soared to 600,000. Franchises grew from 20 to 340 units. Annual revenue jumped from 180 million Brazilian reais to 3 billion Brazilian reais, a growth of over 600% in less than 5 years. It wasn't just a company growing, it was a social phenomenon in motion. Hinode had found its natural element, crisis. The higher the unemployment, the more Brazilians wanted to hear the promise of multi-level marketing. And the company knew how to sell that promise better than any competitor. Training and motivational events became spectacles. Consultants who had come from assembly lines or supermarket checkouts stood on stages before thousands of people recounting how Hinode had changed their lives. Testimonial videos spread across social media with viral speed. The rising sun, indeed, seemed to shine on everyone. What few realized in that moment of collective euphoria was that the very speed of growth was planting the seeds of a silent crisis. A company that doubles in size every year rarely manages to build the necessary internal structure at the same pace to sustain such growth. And Hinode, despite all the brilliance of its events, was no exception to this relentless law of business. Hinode's peak didn't happen gradually, it exploded. Between 2014 and 2018, the company experienced a golden age that seemed to defy all laws of corporate physics. Revenue soared from 180 million Brazilian reais to 2.7 billion Brazilian reais in less than a decade. The company was named Company of the Year by the Brazilian Association of Personal Hygiene, Perfumery and Cosmetics Industry in 2016. In 2017, it won the same award from Atualidade Cosmetica magazine. The numbers were so impressive they began to unsettle established giants in the sector, like Natura and Avon, companies with decades of history and global structures, who suddenly found themselves competing for space with a brand born in a São Paulo garage. The most symbolic moment of this zenith occurred in December 2018. To celebrate the company's 30th anniversary, Hinode rented Allianz Parque, São Paulo's most modern football stadium, and gathered over 35,000 consultants for a two-day event. The spectacle featured international-level lighting, motivational speakers, music, and battle cries. For those present, it was impossible not to believe that Hinode would be eternal. The rising sun seemed destined to shine forever. That same year, the company expanded operations to Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, taking its first concrete steps towards internationalization. The product portfolio had grown to nearly 1,000 different variations, encompassing perfumes, makeup, hair products, food supplements, gourmet coffee, granola, and even powdered yogurt. The logic was clear. If consultants already trusted the brand for cosmetics, why not expand that trust to other markets? Ambition was total, caution non-existent. But there, in that illuminated stadium, amidst the shouts of enthusiasm and the fireworks, something was fundamentally wrong. And the first to feel it were precisely the consultants who formed the base of that entire structure. The central problem lay in a mechanism that was seemingly technical but devastatingly cruel in practice: the mandatory monthly activation. For a consultant to keep their bonuses and commissions active within the Hinode system, they needed to make minimum monthly product purchases. It didn't matter if they had managed to sell the previous month's stock. It didn't matter if the region where they lived was in recession. If they didn't buy, they lost their benefits. Month after month, consultants accumulated boxes of perfumes in their bedrooms, hallways, and home garages, going into debt to maintain their status within the network, betting that at some point sales would cover the investment. For many, that moment never came. Complaints began to appear on Reclame Aqui, a Brazilian consumer complaint website, and social media in increasing volume. Frustrated consultants reported product shortages in franchises, defects in perfume bottles, difficulty reselling, and the bitter feeling that the system forced them to buy to sustain the structure above them, not to sell for real profit. The word pyramid began to circulate frequently. The company vehemently denied it, and technically, they were right. The multi-level marketing model is legal in Brazil, but the line between a legitimate business and a structure that benefits those at the top at the expense of those at the bottom is often thinner than contracts let on. While complaints accumulated at the base at the top, Hinode's leadership faced a different but equally serious problem. The company had grown faster than its management capacity allowed. Eduardo Freire, global vice president of sales and marketing, would later admit with rare honesty that the company was not structured for such gigantic growth. Logistics systems couldn't keep up with demand. The supply chain regularly collapsed, resulting in product shortages precisely when consultants needed them most. Performance was difficult to measure. Retaining consultants became an increasing challenge in a network of 850,000 registered members, of whom only a fraction were truly active. Then came 2019. Revenue, which had reached 2.7 billion Brazilian reais in 2018, plummeted to 1.5 billion Brazilian reais in a single year. A drop of 1.2 billion Brazilian reais in 12 months was not a course correction, it was a collapse. The company cut 37% of its workforce. Approximately 35 franchises were closed. The 850,000 registered consultants in 2019 dwindled to 650,000. The product portfolio, which had reached nearly 1,000 items, was cut in half. Products like gourmet coffee and powdered yogurt silently disappeared from the catalog, as if they had never existed. The company had tried to be everything to everyone simultaneously, and discovered, in the worst possible way, that this strategy doesn't work when the internal structure isn't prepared to support it. The extensive catalog was not just an exaggerated ambition, it was a concrete operational problem, making it difficult to train new consultants and rendering logistics impossible to manage efficiently. Each new product added complexity, and complexity in a system that relies on the ability of ordinary people to sell and receive goods quickly is a slow poison. The combination of mandatory activation, stagnant stock, precarious logistics, and a bloated portfolio had created a perfect storm. And while the leadership tried to understand the extent of the problem, the consultants at the base continued to lose money, trust, and time. The restructuring that followed was painful in a way that motivational events could never disguise. Hinode entered the following years in a process of controlled dismantling, trying to save what it could of a structure that had grown beyond any real control capacity. The company hired market professionals to accelerate the professionalization of management. It called KPMG to conduct its first external audit in history, an implicit admission that for years it had operated without the transparency a business of that size required. The portfolio was progressively cut. From almost 1,000 specifications in 2018, it reached 329 items by December 2020. Each product cut was, at the same time, an achievement of rationality and a confession of excess. The numbers of the following years tell a story of survival without triumph. In 2020, revenue reached 16 billion Brazilian reais, a modest growth of 5% compared to the previous year, achieved even amidst the ongoing pandemic. In 2021, the international market accounted for 27% of the total revenue of 4 billion Brazilian reais, a figure 13% lower than in 2020. The company had experienced 3 consecutive years of losses before returning to profitability, and the recovery was fragile, uncertain, more akin to convalescence than a robust comeback. In 2023, estimates indicated revenue close to 750 million Brazilian reais, about 1/4 of the historical peak of 2018. The distance between the illuminated Allianz Park and those figures was staggering. The mechanism that had most destroyed the company's reputation, the mandatory monthly activation, was finally eliminated. The change was necessary and urgent, but it came too late for the hundreds of thousands of consultants who had already lost money, relationships, and hope within the system. Many had compromised savings, taken out loans, convinced friends and family to join the network, and then had to explain, without adequate words, why the dream had not materialized. The human toll of that crisis was invisible in financial spreadsheets but profoundly real. In the life stories scattered across Brazil, the company attempted to rebuild its image for a new era. In 2024, it launched the Vibes line, with communication strategies aimed at Generation Z and an active presence on TikTok. The initiative recognized, albeit implicitly, that the audience that had sustained growth in previous years had become disillusioned. It was necessary to start anew, with new faces, new language, and new consumers who did not carry the bitter memory of the previous model. Internationalization continued as a banner. Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Chile, Bolivia, and Ecuador were part of the Hinode Group's map. The declared goal was to triple in size by 2025 and have half of its revenue come from abroad. Ambitious targets for a company still in the process of healing. But the gap between what Hinode promised and what it delivered had become the central theme of its story. And this distance was not just financial. It was the distance between the narrative of the rising sun and the reality of indebted consultants, between the shouts of enthusiasm in stadiums and the awkward silence that followed when the numbers didn't add up. It was the distance between a promise and an illusion, and that frontier, once crossed in public perception, is rarely fully recovered. What Hinode's story reveals with almost surgical clarity are lessons that transcend the cosmetics market and apply to any business, any leadership, any systems that grows too fast without looking at what is happening at its own base. The first lesson is that growth without structure is merely an accumulation of problems disguised as success. Hinode went from 35,000 to 850 consultants in a few years, expanded its portfolio to almost 1,000 products, opened hundreds of franchises, and celebrated every number as a victory. But none of these numbers were anchored in an operation capable of sustaining that scale. When the gears jammed, they jammed at all points simultaneously, and there was insufficient structure to bear the weight of what had been built, without adequate foundations. Any system that prioritizes the speed of expansion over the solidity of operations is, in fact, building a debt that will later be collected with interest. The second lesson is that business models that transfer risk to the most vulnerable links in the chain are fundamentally unstable. Hinode's mandatory monthly activation was not just a commercial mechanism. It was a systematic transfer of financial risk from the business owners to the grassroots consultants. People who, for the most part, had fewer resources, less information, and less bargaining power than the corporate structure that recruited them. When this type of model collapses, those who bear the gravest consequences are not the executives on the upper floors, but those at the bottom, convinced they were building a future when they were actually financing someone else's growth. The third lesson is that a narrative has an expiration date. Hinode was, in essence, a company that sold a story before it sold a product. The story of the rising sun, of the entrepreneur who starts in a garage and conquers the world, of the woman from the periphery who changes her life with determination, was powerful and genuine in its origins. But when the narrative detaches from the reality experienced by its protagonists, it not only loses strength, it transforms into its own opposite. What was once inspiration turns into resentment. What was a promise turns into an accusation. And regaining the trust of a generation that felt deceived requires much more than a new line of perfumes on TikTok. Hinode still exists, still sells, and still has active consultants spread across Brazil and Latin America. But the Brazil that knew it at its peak, that Brazil of packed stadiums and dreams shouted in unison, is a Brazil that will not return. The rising sun, which once illuminated so much, also cast shadows that many people still carry.